Well, Howard, thank you very much. And what a delight it is to be speaking to this august joint assembly. There are so many brilliant think tanks on the centre-right in London, and we legislators don't have time to keep up with the works of more than one or two of them. But I always feel that I have a certain relationship with the CPS, under whose auspices I took my first tottering steps in politics. I published my first pamphlet in their interest 20 years ago, and they continue still to plant the flag of debate a little bit in advance of the vanguard. And it's wonderful to see them here. It's particularly wonderful to see them here with the 1900 Club. I think it's an essential part of conservatism that we have a Burkean reverence for the wisdom of those who have done it before, those former parliamentarians, including my good friend Sir Clive, who can remember the foundation of this club in 1906, following that Liberal defeat. They haven't changed, you know, the Lib Dems, as they were. So it's wonderful. I feel rather like having this sort of maternal relationship with the CPS and this Burkean filial reverence for the 1900 Club. I feel as a child whose parents have perhaps undergone a trial separation and are now reunited in the room. It's wonderful to have you all here, especially after the week that I've just been having in Brussels. We are going through the Commission hearing nominations. What a relief to come back to these gorgeous British surroundings after sitting through the committee hearings that we've just had. One after another, the candidates proclaiming their belief in a federal Europe, in a United States of Europe, elbowing each other aside in their keenness to show how incredibly Euro-zealous they are. Our own Lord Hill proudly told his hearing yesterday that he would always put the EU interest above that of the City of London, and he went on to boast that, at least in a personal capacity, he was not a supporter of the United Kingdom's legal challenge against the cap on bonuses in financial services, which I found interesting. I mean, you don't really have to be that Eurosceptic or that conservative to quirk an eyebrow at Brussels telling private companies how they may remunerate their staff. But actually, Lord Hill is probably, who of course never stood for office, I don't think he's ever stood for any kind of election ever. He was a lobbyist. But he's actually one of the more democratic of the Commission nominees. Most of the others in the classic Brussels tradition have come to the European Commission having just been rejected by their voters. Or in one case, the case of the Slovenian outgoing Prime Minister, she lost the election and then just had time to appoint herself as the Slovenian Commission nominee. She's, of course, following the example of Mr. Juncker, who, after 18 years of running Luxembourg, had just lost the election and been thrown out by the voters of the Grand Duchy. So don't let anybody tell you in that tired, old Eurosceptic plaint that the European Commission is undemocratic. My lords and ladies and gentlemen, it's much worse than that. Uniquely, we have contrived a system that is anti-democratic in the sense that you only get to go there when you have been expressly rejected by your voters. It's only when, like Kinnock or Mandelson or Patton, it's only when you've been thrown out that you are invited to come and legislate for them anyway. Now, it's easy to become depressed. I was sinking into a certain melancholia yesterday as I listened to all this bilge coming out of the mouths of the nominees. And I'd like to talk about the perils of pessimism, because I think this is something to which conservatives are perhaps disproportionately prone. Readiness to look on the dark side. Belief that the best is past and that decline awaits us. And it's a very old sense. I discovered a phrase of Lord Macaulay's written in 1848 where he said, "It may be true, they may be correct, who say that the best is behind us and that decline awaits. But so said every previous generation with as much apparent cause." And the brute facts, the hard data, are unremittingly cheerful. Most people, in most places, are living happier, healthier, more fulfilled lives than our grandparents would have imagined possible. Of course, there are occasional reverses, recessions and wars, but the general trend, since mankind discovered the wonders of trade and exchange and specialization, has been upwards. If you look at all the most basic measurements, longevity, literacy, infant mortality, calorie intake, height, things are getting better, and are getting better at an accelerating rate, and yet in every generation the publishers will always reward the author who has the most dire outlook. Now, the cause that changes with fashion, that changes from generation to generation. I can remember when people were very worried about global cooling. Now they're all very worried about global warming. It could be bird flu, or it could be swine flu, or it could be drugs-resistant superbugs, or it could be asteroid strikes. It could be nuclear holocaust, it could be underpopulation, or overpopulation, or Islamization, or the debt crisis. The cause, as I say, changes with fashion, but the underlying argument never changes. This time it's going to be different. Up until now, things have got stubbornly better and better, but this time it's going to be different. And as I say, as J.S. Mill observed, you are always regarded as a sage when you say that terrible things are in store. And nobody ever picks you up on it and says, hang on, that didn't happen. They continue to take your next blockbusting thesis. So I would like to talk about our relationship with the European Union in a cheerful and optimistic spirit. Not only because I think that that is apt and true, but also because I think it makes tactical sense. When conservatives focus on the things they don't like, and don't get me wrong, there are plenty of things not to like. Let's leave Europe aside. There's the debt crisis, there's the way our values are traduced and our patriotism is scorned, the way our children and grandchildren are being laden with these financial burdens. It's easy to get angry. It's easy to become curmudgeonly. I catch myself doing it sometimes. But we are at our most persuasive and at our most electorally successful when, like Margaret Thatcher here, like Ronald Reagan in the US, when we imbue our message with a little hint of warmth, a little breath of optimism, a sense that the best lies ahead. Think of what happened in the recent referendum in Scotland. Look at the way in which steadily, in defiance of all predictions and models, which tell you that there is a swing to the status quo during the final 2 months of the campaign, look at the way Alex Salmond persistently narrowed the gap. Don't let the final outcome blind you to who won the campaign and which way the opinion polls moved. He began with a deficit of more than 20%, and he closed with half of that deficit. Why? Because of his relentless good cheer, both about the prospects of a yes vote and about the prospects of an independent Scotland. And whatever was thrown at him about the currency, about the EU membership, about the disinvestment, it was swallowed up by that supernova of optimism that he gave off. Where at the other side, well, they were talking about all the things that would go wrong. Now, they may have had a point. I think on most of those issues, they did have a point. But even when people are convinced, they don't like to hear it like that. And that's, I think, the mistake that Eurosceptics are set to make in the analogous referendum campaign here. It's called by some commentators the Barrage Paradox. The better that UKIP does in the opinion polls, the further the withdrawalist sentiment sinks. The one is purchasing its success at the expense of the other. And it's not hard to see why that is. UKIP is focusing on all the things that it doesn't like. And even when issue by issue people agree with those issues, with those questions, the general impression of anger, nostalgia, is off-putting. Let me put that in a more reductionist way. In a referendum campaign, if one side is talking about trade and investment, and the other side is talking about Romanians and Bulgarians, which side sounds grown up? Which side sounds convincing? So I would like, in the time that I have tonight, to make a positive, economic, democratic, constitutional and cheerful case for how much better Britain could be doing. Freed from what is the real nostalgia here, which is this 1950s vision of a European bloc. And let me put that argument in one episode, one fact. At the beginning of this year, the European Union shelved its free trade talks with India. And at the same time, EFTA, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland and Liechtenstein, announced that they expect to sign a comprehensive free trade agreement with the Republic of India by next year. Now, when we bear in mind that India grew by 4.4% last year, while the European Union shrank by 0.3%, the Eurozone shrank by 0.9%, I would say that gives those EFTA countries quite an advantage. Is there any state in this part of the world that stands to gain more from unrestricted commerce with that rising giant than the United Kingdom? India is a common law democracy. It is certainly for business purposes English-speaking. It is the fourth largest investor here. It owns Tetley, it owns Jaguar. There are 1.4 million Britons of Indian origin, and yet we cannot sign a free trade agreement with India or with anyone else because we gave that power to the European Union on the day we joined, the 1st of January 1973. On the 1st of June, Norway and Switzerland signed, or rather gave effect to, the free trade agreements that they'd earlier signed with China. China grew at 7.7% last year. The European Union, to remind you, shrank by 0.3%. The Eurozone shrank by 0.9%. My friends, we are in the wrong place. We don't sit on great natural resources in this beautiful, damp, green island of ours. We have to make our way in the world by what we buy and sell, and that means we have to be where the customers are, and increasingly they are not in Europe. Here's a scary statistic. The year that we joined, 1973, Western Europe was 36% of world GDP. Today that figure is 23%. In 2020, it will be 15%. I write a blog for the Daily Telegraph, and I made a throwaway comment in it not long ago. I said, every continent on the planet is now experiencing economic growth, except Antarctica and Europe. And a Spanish friend got in touch very crossly. He sent me these reams of data, and I had to concede as I read through his figures that he was right and I was wrong. Antarctica's doing fine. Cruise ships are returning, and the Antarctican economy is rebounding in line with everyone else's. We are trapped in the only trade bloc on the planet that is dwindling economically. We're sundered from the hinterland to which we're connected by our history and our geography. I was born in Lima, Peru. I spent the first years of my life in the then large Anglo-Peruvian community. At the end of last year, I went back and visited, probably for the first time since being baptized there, the Anglican church in Lima, the Church of the Good Shepherd in Miraflores. And it was a very melancholy experience. Everyone was very nice, but the congregation was 3 or 4 people. And the nave is about the width that this room is long. It was built on its present site in 1949 to accommodate a large Anglican congregation in the days when we were still a global trading nation. The British, or the Anglo-Peruvian community into which I was born, ran the mines, the shipping, the railways, the canals, and above all the textiles. In the 1970s, as the Common External Tariff was erected in phases, on every continent, In South America, in Asia, in Africa, we had the melancholy long withdrawing war as Britain turned its back on the world and focused on this little patch of Europe. It's no place for us to be, by temperament, by history, or by geography. I'd like to, in the spirit of optimism again, talk a little bit about what we could do. The idea has got around that people who are critical of the EU are unappeasable. We are mad, angry, fanatical, zealous. Anything that David Cameron or any future British government were to bring back from Brussels would only stoke even more unreasonable demands. Let me, in a constructive, helpful, and I hope optimistic spirit, suggest 10 things that if I were Prime Minister, I would be looking for in terms of reforming our relationship with the European Union. The first of them is the one I've just mentioned, trade. It seems to me critical that the United Kingdom should be able to sign a bilateral FTA with Australia. Now you may say, well, that right there you've completely ruled out any kind of relationship with the European Union because the common external tariff is the essence of the whole thing. Actually, I'm not sure that's true. If we withdrew from the common agricultural policy, right there you've got rid of the bulk of the common external tariff. There are large sectors to which the external tariff doesn't apply anyway. There may well be a way that we could negotiate, for example, that new technologies, new sectors, those which are not covered by existing EU trade policy, would not be automatically drawn into it, but would remain national prerogatives. The EU-controlled bit would then be swallowed up by the natural growth of the private sector, be left like one of those temples in the jungle with the undergrowth smashing its way through the flags. The most important thing, we are the only country in Europe that exports more outside the EU than to the EU. We're the only one. We are therefore uniquely penalised by the common external tariff. Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, they are all members of the single market. They're all covered by free movement of goods and services and capital, and with some restrictions in the case of Switzerland people. But they critically are able to sign free trade accords with third countries. I don't believe that we wouldn't be able to do the same. And when you bear in mind that Norway, per capita, sells 2.5 times as much to the EU as we do, that Switzerland sells 4.5 times as much from the outside, I don't believe it would prejudice our exports to Europe. Second thing, implied by the first thing, a British agricultural policy. If I were to sit here and try and invent the most wasteful, corrupt, expensive, immoral, bureaucratic system of farm support that I could think of, I would not come close to the common agricultural policy, which penalises us over and over again as consumers, as taxpayers, and particularly hits the United Kingdom. We are a net food importer with a relatively efficient farming sector. We're clobbered both ways. We pay more into the system and take less out of it. Now, there is an argument to be had, a philosophical argument to be had about whether you should subsidise farmers, whether you should recognise the contribution that landowners make in terms of the stewardship of our countryside. If you decided that your priority was to make our farmers better off, then simply by not routing the money through Brussels anymore, simply by giving a direct grant based on acreage or land quality, you could increase the income of every farmer in Britain and still see lower food prices and lower taxes, because we would no longer be paying the bulk of our money to subsidise their rivals across the channel. Third thing, common fisheries policy. Again, the United Kingdom has 60% of the fish stocks in the North Sea. But under CFP rules, we have a quota that is equivalent to 25% by volume or 15% by value. Although, of course, that's now becoming rather arbitrary because there are no longer any fish. This is the tragedy of the commons, something that I hope I don't need to explain to a conservative audience. It's the ancient wisdom of Aristotle, that which nobody owns, nobody will care for. As soon as you define fish stocks as a common resource to which all member states have equal access, you get what we've had, a race to hoover up such stocks that are there without any incentive to treat it as a renewable resource. every other country that has ownership of its waters, Iceland, Norway, the Falkland Islands, New Zealand, has come up with schemes to make skippers have a stake in growing the resource. You can't do that if the waters are jointly owned. Fourth thing, foreign policy. We're a member of the UN Security Council. We're the fourth military power. Why do we need to be routing our foreign policy through Baroness Ashton or now this Italian lady? Are we not capable of having diplomatic representation without needing to be part of a wider European common foreign and security policy, without needing to have these blue and gold flags on all our embassies? I mean, if we're not capable of doing this, who is? How does Jamaica manage? or South Africa? I mean, what an extraordinary thing that we, of all countries, think we're not able to have influence in the world independently. I mean, the risk of stating the obvious, you have more influence when you have your own foreign policy. Norway has a population of 4 million. Look at how active Norwegian diplomats are around the world. They negotiated the partition in the Sudan. They're active in the peace talks in Sri Lanka, in Southeast Asia, obviously in the Israel-Palestine, the Oslo cause. They're able to do all of those things with less than a tenth of our population because they have their own foreign policy. Extraordinary that should need to be stated. And yet, as with all of these things, and you'll see a theme here in a moment, the British government at the moment is not even requesting it. On the contrary, it's going in the other direction. EU citizenship. How many of us are really enriched by being citizens of the European Union? Something that we were turned into overnight in 1992. Remember Norman Tebbett's great speech at the 1992 party conference? The last time we had a party conference in Brighton. Do you want to be citizens of the European Union? From that common citizenship stem most of the things that have caused most of the popular discontent with the EU now. Reciprocal voting rights, reciprocal residence rights, and reciprocal welfare claims. There's no point in trying to nibble at the edges of those things. You should come straight to the root cause and say that we are UK citizens with one nationality, and any bilateral agreements that we choose to enter into with neighbouring countries or with any other countries around the world on reciprocal entitlement to healthcare or social security or pensions will be done voluntarily and by agreement, not by diktat of a European court. Which brings me on to number 6, which follows on from citizenship, which is the symbols that go with it. The European Union is acquiring, one by one, the attributes and trappings of statehood. Passport, driver's license, national anthem, flag, national day, national slogan. Do you know, we are now expected to stand to attention in the European Parliament when they play Beethoven's 9th Symphony. I don't know whether you've read or seen the film of A Clockwork Orange, but it has the same effect on me now as it has on poor Alex, and for the same reason, which is bad connotations and disgraceful connotations to a sublime piece of music. I want to shout with him that poor old Ludwig van only wrote music and didn't deserve this. Isn't that the lowest of low-hanging fruit for a British government to bring back? Scrapping of the symbols and trappings that annoy so many people and that really would cost us nothing. And yet it's not on the agenda. The Foreign Office isn't even considering it. Now a big one. Fiscal autonomy. All in mode now when we talk about Scottish devolution. What about some fiscal autonomy for the UK? In other words, no financial transactions tax, no EU carbon taxes or other green taxes, and let's not stop there. Why do we allow the European Union to dictate levels of indirect taxation? Shouldn't we be having tax competition? Shouldn't we be encouraging jurisdictional competition and thereby downward pressure on rates? Harmonised taxes, which is the big idea in Brussels at the moment, is a way for uncompetitive countries to get out of having to make the domestic reforms that they don't dare put to their publics by exporting their costs to their rivals. It is why Europe is now, unlike even Antarctica, the only shrinking continent. If the rest of the EU is determined to maim itself in this fashion, I don't see why Britain should feel obliged to follow suit. Criminal justice. This is 8th on my list of 10. Again, something that was introduced at Maastricht. We could survive perfectly well before that. Why are we part of the... it's a wonderfully Orwellian title that they give it. It was invented in '98. Something called the Area of Freedom, Security and Justice. And what that means is what they describe in Brussels as a common judicial space, like a single market for law. A fairly major issue if you are one of the 2 common law countries in the European Union, where, as so often, the odd ones out. We're the ones who have to change more than anybody else in order to accommodate the new me. There's a pan-European magistracy being created. You probably haven't heard of this, but welcome to my world, called Eurojust. There's an embryonic European police force called Europol. But this is not just a theoretical problem. You'll have all seen what happened to my constituents, the King family, the family who took their little boy out of Southampton Hospital and committed the appalling offence of suggesting that there might be better treatment than the British NHS can offer. As I say, they're constituents of mine. I came in the next morning and I said to myself, this is all we're going to do today. This is a shocking case, and it's a remediable injustice. You know, I want you to get onto the CPS, I want you to get onto the police. We saw British bureaucracy at its worst there, but the one lot of people who I cannot criticise are the Spanish authorities, who were incredibly helpful, incredibly apologetic. One of them said to me, one of the people in the Justice Department who was in charge of that case in Malaga said, "Señor Diputado, you know, we're Spanish, we love children. Can you imagine us wanting to separate this 5-year-old from his mother when he hasn't been apart from us since the day he fell ill?" He said, "You have to understand, it's the European arrest warrant. It's the most powerful vehicle in the judicial arsenal. It was intended as an anti-terrorist measure. We don't have any discretion beyond the discretion of checking that the person is the one named on the document. That's as far as we have any leeway." Now, think about that. It's in a way sort of inevitable part of human nature, isn't it? It may have been intended as an anti-terrorist measure, but if you put that power into the hands of the police and the hands of the CPS, people being what people are, they will start using it routinely, as indeed they have. This is, by the way, not the first time that a life of a constituent of mine has been wrecked by this wretched device. Another constituent of mine, a couple of years ago, was celebrating his A-levels in Greece. There was a fracker in a nightclub which he was nowhere near. It was a case of very obvious mistaken identity. A boy was killed. The case against my constituent was so obviously based on fabricated statements. Everyone knew that it would be thrown out within 5 minutes of it coming to court, as indeed it was. In the meantime, this boy had spent nearly 3 years in Athens under house arrest, 11 months of them in one of the nastiest prisons in Europe, waiting for his case to come to trial. You think of the rows we had in this country about 42-day detention, and yet at the same time we're allowing this to happen under the European arrest warrant. When he finally got home, the people with whom he had been celebrating his A-levels were celebrating their graduation. And how do you give that back to a boy of that age? This is the reality. It is incredible to me and shameful that at the moment, after the European elections, when the Conservative Party is swanking about how tough it's going to get in Europe, the Home Secretary is opting back in to the European arrest warrant from which we had previously opted out. It is absolutely inexplicable. Well, actually, the explanation is the police want it. Well, of course the police want it. I mean, a country where you automatically do whatever the police want is the definition of a police state, isn't it? The whole point of having you parliamentarians is precisely that we're a civilian country and we don't just do what the security services tell us to. 2 more in my list of 10. And this one I'll mention just because it's a neat example of how we have diluted what was previously our position. When he stood for the leadership of the Conservative Party, David Cameron said he wanted to repatriate all social and employment policy from Brussels. And remarkable as this may seem, Nick Clegg had actually said something similar. When he was an MEP, he said this is a good example of where Brussels is overreached. Even I, as a great pro-European, think that it is bad and anti-competitive for employment law and social policy to be set at EU level. So, the policy found its way into both manifestos and indeed into the coalition agreement. But it's now been dropped. And it's now been dropped because, frankly, and I'll come on to this in a moment, everything has been dropped that might require a treaty change. Number 10, last one, but I think this is the biggest. Supremacy of British law on British soil. To put that in a technical sense, reforming sections 2 and 3 of the 1972 European Communities Act so that EU law would no longer have automatic primacy in British courts, so that EU directives and regulations would be treated as advisory pending an implementing decision by Parliament. Again, people will say, oh, that means leaving the EU. You know, this doctrine of direct effect was not written into the treaties. It was invented by the European Court of Justice in the 1960s in a series of power grabs, of examples of flagrant judicial activism where they awarded themselves, in a kind of judicial coup d'etat, powers that the national governments had never agreed to give them. I don't believe that the whole European Union would stop working if you recognise the supremacy of national legal systems, which, by the way, every country with a written constitution does in its own constitution. We uniquely have no such protection. So those, just to recap, those would be the 10 things that I would go in looking for. Independent trade policy, no CAP, no CFP, independent diplomatic and foreign policy, British rather than EU citizenship, an end to the symbols and trappings, fiscal autonomy, common law, not EU law, repatriation of social and employment policy, and supremacy of the House of Commons. But I don't want to be unreasonable about this. You know, maybe we could get some of them and not others. If pushed, I would say that the two most important are trade and parliamentary supremacy. But it may be that, you know, on that list of 10, we could get 6 of them or 3 of them. At present, HMG is not pushing for any of them. It's really the one point I wanted to leave with you, because in the whole European debate, this is the area where there is the biggest mismatch between what has been said officially and on the record and what the public seems to have understood. People keep saying, clever, respectable commentators keep saying, well, we'll have to see if the PM is able to bring anything back, and we'll have to see when he shows his hand and so on. In March, David Cameron wrote an article in the Sunday Telegraph in which he set out what our negotiating position would be. He set out these 7 aims of things he intended to bring back. I mean, the essence of them being that none of them required a treaty change. None of them really. All of them could be proclaimed to have been fulfilled virtually now. 1 or 2 of them actually went further. 1 or 2 of them, you know, under the rubric of completing the single market, we actually mean giving Brussels more power. Well, that's an easy sell in Brussels, believe me. But of the only one that I think might require some written acknowledgement is an opt-out for Britain from ever closer union. Not a treaty change, just a sort of coda saying that it doesn't apply to Britain. Well, surprise, surprise, as soon as that list had been published, Ken Clarke popped up on television and said, yes, I heartily endorse all of these things. Wonderful, because they don't change anything. And the Deputy Prime Minister then said exactly the same thing. He was on the Mar programme. What about these things that David Cameron wants to bring about? Oh, yes, he said, I'm very, very happy with those. We worked on it together, you know, because they don't really alter our status in Europe. And yet, bizarrely, this doesn't seem to have sunk in at all, even among very political people, including possibly 1 or 2 of the brilliant people in this room. And people are still saying, well, let's wait and see what he brings back. I can guarantee that on the basis of those 7 proclaimed aims, any British government will be able to come back and declare victory. And I will further guarantee that it will be done with lots of choreography from the other European leaders to make out that it was a bigger thing than it really was. You can be certain that Angela Merkel will, like some character in one of those commando comics, say, we have been completely outflanked by the Englanders. And no doubt some of our cretinous journalists will write it up that way. But the reality is there an intergovernmental conference? Does there need to be a parliamentary ratification in the other 27 countries? Because if not, nothing has changed. Nothing of any significance. And this is the point I want to make. We are wasting a generational opportunity to make that change. We could have got, if we'd applied some of the criteria that I was talking about, we could have established the precedent of having a different kind of status. Some kind of associate membership or country club membership or whatever you want to call it, but establish the precedent that Britain could be in the single market but outside most of the political institutions. And had we done that, I can assure you that a number of the other member states would have queued up to ask for a similar deal. But we could have had an altogether more comfortable and flexible Europe, where you could have had a pan-continental market, stretching from Iceland to Armenia, from the Faroe Islands to Georgia, with maybe 40, 45 countries, all bound by the four freedoms of goods, services, people, and capital, within which then, yeah, sure, you would have your group of 20, 25, however many federalist countries, which could go ahead and have their common army and their common police force and their president of Europe, or whatever else. Wouldn't that leave everybody happier? Wouldn't that take the tensions out of the current talks in Brussels? Everyone would be better off. We'd have got what we thought we came for. Common market, not political union. And the federalist countries, well, to borrow from Alex Salmond, they would have lost a bad tenant and gained a good neighbour. But that opportunity, sadly, is not, it's not lost. But the only way to get it, it's now clear, is to vote to leave. I don't see any other route to achieving any repatriation of power other than by leaving and striking such a bargain from the outside as the Swiss do. I opened with a reference to the Scottish referendum. Let me close with a similar one. In every poll prior to the beginning of the formal referendum campaign north of the River, huge majorities of Scots said that they preferred something in between independence and the status quo. When it was put to them as a binary choice, yes, they preferred the status quo. But when they were given the Devo Max option, the idea of full autonomy that would stop short of formal separation, some 80% of voters said that they preferred that option. Now, here's the thing. I think that is a similar lineup when it comes to the issue of the EU. Most people in Britain will say, I do not want the status quo. I want a free trading relationship with Europe. I don't want to pull up the drawbridge either. I want to have a common market, close intergovernmental cooperation, but not provincial status within the United States of Europe. I think that, when it's put in those terms, attracts a similar high percentage. But the critical difference is this. David Cameron, as Prime Minister, was able to say in Scotland, if you vote no, then as PM of the United Kingdom, I will immediately come forward with a new package of devolution. By the way, in his defence, he didn't do this in a panicky response to the opinion polls. He had said this in response to the Strathclyde Commission back at the end of May, when the no side was still comfortably ahead. Again, an example of how our press often missed the point. But in the case of Europe, there's no way that we can achieve those things. There's no way, because they're not even being asked for. And so the only opportunity to get that Devo Max option in Europe is to do it in the way that the EFTA countries do. To do it through bilateral treaty, regulated by the small, loose, effective EFTA regulatory authorities that apply to the whole continent outside the political union. And I'll say this again, let's do it optimistically. Don't let anyone tell you that we're somehow too small to survive, that we're too small to make a go of it. What are the richest countries in Europe? Or, correction, what are the countries with the richest people in Europe? The highest per capita GDP? Norway and Switzerland. The the United Nations ranks them respectively first and second as the best places in the world to be born. Australia is third. Now, ask yourselves, are we really not capable, as a global people, a maritime island people, of thriving as a global power? If 7 million Swiss, if 4 million Norwegians, if 320,000 Icelanders, if 18,000 Liechtensteiners, relying on a series of bilateral free trade agreements, are able to furnish their peoples with the highest standard of living in Europe, how much more can we? A nation of 64 millions of people whose enterprising energies have touched every continent. I always remember that wonderful scene in Skyfall, the last of the Bond movies, where Judi Dench quotes Tennyson's Ulysses. She applies it to our present position as a people. Though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. Ladies and gentlemen, we are the sixth largest economy in the world, but we are scheduled to overtake France and become the fifth largest. Bring on the Germans. We are the fourth military power on the planet. We're one of 5 permanent seat holders on the UN Security Council. Our language is the most widely spoken by the human race. How much bigger do we have to be before we're able to run our own affairs in our own interests, trading with our friends and allies in Europe, but governing ourselves? Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are.